27 May 1945. Munich. In a narrow room above a butcher's shop on Landwehrstrasse, a 34-year-old civilian wrote a sentence he could not have spoken in the stairwell. Wir haben Brot gegen Schweigen getauscht. We traded silence for bread. He signed only Karl. He did not add his surname. He placed the sheet in a notebook and slid it under a loose floorboard. The war had ended 3 weeks before. It had not ended inside him. It had moved into the kitchens, into the stairwells, into the office files he would soon learn to keep. Munich was rubble. The skyline was raw. The Frauenkirche towers stood like broken fingers. The air smelled of damp ash and coal dust. The avenues were choked with brick, beams, glass. Photographs from Allied occupation reports called it a moonscape. Local police logs used another word: Trümmer, rubble. The women who climbed the piles with baskets and gloves were Trümmerfrauen, rubble women. They became a symbol before they became a memory. Karl's first entry after the sentence was blunt. 19 May. Americans everywhere. Curfew 9 p.m. Fright. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. In diaries from Munich, Augsburg, Nuremberg, the same words recur. Americans everywhere. Curfew. Fright. The troops of the 45th Infantry Division moving through Neuhausen and Schwabing. MPs posted at central points. MPs posted at central points. A new rhythm imposed by megaphones and posters. Surrender your weapons. Present yourself. Be inside by 9. Do not congregate. Do not keep radio parts. Do not speak to Soviet POWs. The rules were printed in English and German. The new math was clear. Each rule had its own arithmetic of consequence. In the first weeks, fear was not abstract. Rumors traveled faster than the files. There were stories of retribution. Stories from the east of Red Army rapes and thefts. Stories from villages near Dachau of forced tours of the camp. Allied intelligence summaries note the shock effect. The Americans wanted streets swept. They also wanted eyes opened. In late April, they marched the inhabitants of Dachau town through the wire and past the barracks. In early May, they did the same in Munich. A document in the United States Army's Civil Affairs records reads, "Exhibit of evidence for local population to be confronted with consequences." The arithmetic of confrontation. 200 citizens, 2 hours, the path laid out, the ovens at the end. Karl did not go on that first tour. He would pass through the camp later as part of the housing office. He did not need the images to stiffen his neck. He wrote, "Dachau, no words." He left the page blank. The immediate aftermath was not a single moment. It was a sequence of tiny calculations. The mathematics of hunger, the arithmetic of cold. There were ration cards. There were lists of calories. Children were entitled to more, elderly to less, of calories. Children were printed and stamped. District food officers submitted returns each week. The reports to the military government in Munich showed daily allotments of 1,000 to 1,500 calories in the months after surrender, dipping lower in the winter. The 1946-47 hunger winter bent backs and ethics. Coal was scarce. Potatoes froze in the ground. In the ledger of survival, each day was a balance sheet. A ration book was not enough. Cigarettes became currency. The black market became a market. Bahnhofsvorplatz, midnight coded exchanges. A pound of butter for 5 lux. A pair of boots for 20. Allied soldiers were both police and pipeline. Schiebelein, the sliding. Barter had its own grammar and its own statistics. Allied occupation reports from the U.S. zone estimate that by late 1946, a significant share of urban meat, fats, and textiles moved outside legal channels. The papers call it unofficial distribution. In whispered conversations, it was called life. The black market humbled everyone. The professor traded books for bacon. The widow traded heirlooms for coal. The tenant traded the landlord's wood for warmth. Carl wrote, 2 shirts for potatoes, 1 pack, lucky strike for salt meat. He did not write the rest. He did not write that he resented each trade for the shame it spelled. He did not write that he also felt relief. Necessity made virtue of silence. There were missing family members. Bundesarchiv records for 1945 and 1946 list millions missing in action, unaccounted for, dead. The arithmetic of absence was cruelly simple. The postman's bag was lighter. The kitchen tables were larger. The war did not return them. The war returned without them. People papered pillars with notices, seeking Hansem last seen near Stettin. Seeking Liesel R. fled from Königsberg. The city was a bulletin board of hope and defeat. On 12 June 1945, Karl was called to the district office. The Americans needed clerks. The German mayor, installed after the Gauleiter fled, needed files. They needed someone who could read fast and write clearly, someone without an obvious stain. A neighbor said Karl was a good lad. He had worked in a printing shop and a tax office. He had joined the party in 1937 to keep the job. He had been a follower, not a leader. In the new vocabulary, he was a Mitläufer. He was present, not prominent. Denazification was a word before it was a system. Allied planning memoranda from 1944 outlined it. It became a paper machine in 1945 and 46. The Fragebogen, the questionnaire, landed like a cold stone on kitchen tables. 131 questions in some versions. Some were factual, name, birth date, employment, organizations. Others were accusatory by implication. Did you belong to the NSDAP? To the SA, SS, NS Frauenschaft, DAF, NSV, Hitlerjugend? Did you pay dues, give speeches, attend rallies? Have you been denounced? The Spruchkammern, the tribunals, convened. There were categories. Major offenders, Hauptschuldige. Offenders, belastet. Lesser offenders, minder belastet. Followers, Mitläufer. Exonerated, entlastet. The mathematics of guilt had been formalized. It also had a shadow calculus. Stability versus thorough justice. The Americans wanted a new Germany. They needed administrators and engineers, teachers and rail workers. The thorough purge would have made the system collapse. The practical purge had to be scaled. Karl filled out his questionnaire on 20 August 1945. He wrote that he joined the party to keep his job. He wrote that he had attended 3 meetings in 1937 and then only to listen. He wrote that he had never denounced anyone. He wrote that he had given small sums to the Winterhilfswerk charity because everyone did. He wrote that he had not heard of crimes until 1945. He wrote that he deplored the regime. The phrasing was careful. It was also common. Denazification files in the state archives for the US zone are full of these exact phrases. Nur aus beruflichen Gründen. Only for professional reasons. Nie aus Überzeugung. Never out of conviction. The paper was a confession and a defense. The Spruchkammer called him in November. He sat on a wooden chair in a borrowed courtroom. On the table lay his file, a thin folder held with string. He could have been punished. He could have lost the right to hold a public position. He could have lost the right to hold a public position. He could have gone to prison if evidence emerged that he had done more than keep his job. Denazification was paid out in points and categories. In Bavaria, more than 2.5 million people were filtered. The numbers were staggering. The outcomes, in the end, were lenient. By some estimates, fewer than 10% faced serious penalties. The mathematics of guilt bent toward reintegration long before the Cold War made it policy. Karl was categorized as a Mitläufer, a follower. He was allowed to work. He was assigned to the housing office. He would spend the next 5 years tallying rooms, measuring lives in square meters, learning the arithmetic of walls and doors. In late 1945, people started arriving with a different kind of silence. They came from the east, from Silesia, from East Prussia, from the Sudetenland, expellees. The trains spilled them into Munich in waves. Not just Munich, Hanover, Lübeck, Kiel, small towns in Lower Saxony, cities that had already been broken suddenly had to absorb hundreds of thousands of strangers. The displacement was biblical in scale and bureaucratic in execution. Some were driven out by violence. Some were rounded up and shipped out. Some fled ahead of the Red Army and then were not allowed to return. The numbers are as cold as they are large, between 12 and 14 million in the years immediately after the war. Municipal archives record the Unterbringung, the housing of strangers in already cramped spaces. The arithmetic of rooms was not optional. A widow with 60 square meters was informed she must take a family of 4. A factory worker with a 2-room flat had to share with a farmer and his daughter. The housing office, with men like Karl, filled out forms. Room count, shared kitchen, shared privileges. Each allocation was a small war. Each signature was a small defeat. Hausgemeinschaft, house community, was a word that promised more than the walls could bear. Karl processed the file of a woman called Else B. in February 1946. She had been durchflucht from Breslau. The file is spare, arrived with 2 children, no husband. He assigned her to a 3rd-floor flat in Maxvorstadt, where a painter and his wife had 1 spare room. The painter protested in a letter. Wir haben auch gelitten. We have also suffered. The file contains a note, explained the obligation. The mathematics of scarce rooms did not recognize prior suffering as an exemption. Everyone had suffered. Everyone thought theirs was greater, more deserving of consideration. The office had its own logic. Person per square meter was the new morality. Resentment rose and settled like coal dust. Locals called expellees Polacken, even if they were German. Expellees called locals Stadtfresser, who had hoarded food. The city council minutes reveal arguments over relief shares, over schools, over jobs. There was compassion too. There were organized drives to collect clothing. There were church groups distributing milk. There were neighbors who taught newcomers the tram routes. The archive holds both, the letters of complaint and the lists of donations. The contact with victims was a different kind of mathematics. It was not about rooms or calories. It was about the weight of knowledge. Displaced persons. Jews liberated from camps, forced laborers from Ukraine and Poland, POWs lived in camps near German towns. Feldafing, near Munich, Landsberg, Fehrenwald. The DP camps had their own councils, their own schools, their own theaters. They were worlds within a world that did not know what to say. American occupation reports described tensions between DPs and locals. The DPs received UN RO and then IRO rations that sometimes exceeded German rations. The arithmetic of envy was plain. They have more meat, one Bavarian farmer complained. They have shoes. The farmer did not write what the DPs had lost. The farmer did not have to. It was visible in numbers tattooed on forearms, in the way the DPs stood, in the songs sung in the camps on Friday nights. Local Germans saw the barbed wire. They did not always see the difference between a camp that imprisoned and a camp that sheltered. Feldafing had a drama club, a newspaper, a rabbinical court. A survivor there, in a letter preserved in an oral history collection, wrote, "We live next to those who watched us die." That is harsh. It is also an exaggeration. Many Germans had truly not seen. Many had seen differently. Many had heard rumors. Many had chosen to ignore. The mathematics of knowledge, like the mathematics of guilt, is not clean. In October 1945, the Americans posted flyers ordering citizens near Dachau to come and see a film. Nazi concentration camps. The screening records show packed halls and stony faces. The reactions were recorded in Allied intelligence summaries. Some said it was propaganda. Some cried. Some left. Some said, "We did not know." Some said, "We could do nothing." Many said nothing. Silence is a number too. It cannot be counted, but it counts. Karl's colleague in the housing office, a man named Schmid, wrote in his own notebook, "A woman came to ask for a larger room. She said her husband had been at Dachau as a guard. She said he was not cruel. She said he had only done his job. The Spruchkammer would have had a category for him. The neighborhood had a different math. A person can be neighbor, guard, husband, father, expense, liability, acquaintance, ghost. The ledger is not balanced." The hunger winter of 1946-47 took the breath from the city. January was brutal. Coal trains were delayed. Water pipes froze. The caloric arithmetic tightened its grip. Regional authorities pleaded with the Americans for more grain. The reports from the U.S. Food and Agriculture section are dry. Imports insufficient to meet urban demand. Dry. Mothers went to the countryside to organize food, a soft word for hard bargaining. They walked dozens of kilometers to farms to trade linens for eggs. The farms had no surplus. A farmer's ledger was no less spare than the city's. Everyone was doing the mathematics of survival with numbers that did not add to a whole. On 20 June 1948, at last, a different arithmetic. Currency reform. The Deutsche Mark. The Reichsmark. The Reichsmark, soaked in inflation and suspicion, was exchanged in careful ratios. A whisper went through Munich that week. The whisper was hope. The new notes were clean, blue-gray, crisp. They smelled like possibility. The black market took a blow. Prices in legal shops frozen for years were freed. Shelves that had been bare filled quickly. The backlog of hoarded goods came out. The change was not magical. The suffering did not end in a weekend. But the cognitive shift was real. Americans and German administrators called it psychologische Wirkung, the psychological effect. For Karl, it meant that he could buy shoes without theater paragraphs. It meant the pimply boy offering cigarettes under the Bahnhof Bridge disappeared. The Marshall Plan shipments began to alter the texture of days. Crates labeled ERP European Recovery Program arrived at German docks and railheads. Flour, sugar, machinery, fertilizer. The statistics are granular. The textiles, the barrels of oil, the machine tools are all counted in those reports. The mathematics of recovery was a list of commodities and kilowatts. The intangible item confidence was not in the crates. It was in the way people walked to work. Factories that had survived were patched and retooled. New factories rose on old foundations. A machine tool plant in Augsburg, a chemical works near Ludwigshafen. The BMW workshops in Munich, battered by war, returned to life making pots, then motorcycles. Each plant had a labor roster. Each roster had names that had been in different organizations in 1943. Men who had worn NSDAP pins wore factory badges. The badge changed faster than the memory. Karl stayed in the housing office. The work was endless. New buildings were planned. New estates in Giesing, in Neuperlach on the drawing boards by the late 1950s. The destroyed neighborhoods were reimagined as roads first, community second. Modernist lines cut through old patterns. The files changed from crisis allocations to waiting lists. Position in line had numbers. Those numbers had meanings that could be adjusted by insider knowledge, by friendly words, by a Persilschein, a whitewashing certificate from a pastor or a neighbor vouching for someone. The mathematics of fairness was a series of exceptions. He learned to speak a language that did not accuse. He learned to write words that were true enough to stand in a file and not enough to start a fire. He learned to overlook in order to go on. Frau X war mit Luftwaffe unauffällig. He wrote it often. He believed it sometimes. Other times he thought of the films and of Feldafing and wrote it anyway. The system required stability. The Americans said so in their own blunt calculations. If the Cold War required a reliable Western zone, then continuity was a security measure. The 131 Gesetz, the 131 Law of 1951, guaranteed pensions and rehiring of former civil servants dismissed after 1945. Thousands returned to desks. The arithmetic of guilt shifted further toward subtraction. The files acquired a new layer. Schoolbooks changed too. The first textbooks under Allied control were brutally honest. They documented the dictatorship. They named the crimes. They named the dead. They asked for reflection. By the early 1950s, as states regained authority, the text softened. Hitler und seine Bande. Hitler and his gang. A few bad men had misled a good people. The children learned of hunger, of the air war, of flight and expulsion. They learned less about perpetrators in their towns. Memorial days commemorated bombings. Commemorations for murdered Jews were sporadic. The arithmetic of memory balanced to comfort. It did not balance to truth. Karl had a daughter in 1949. He named her Eva. He wrote, "I will tell her some things, not all." He was not alone. Oral histories collected decades later are full of children who describe silence at dinner. They heard the word früher in the past, and then forks scraped plates. The silence was not a conspiracy. It was a blanket thrown over a wound to get through winter. The politics of the Federal Republic depended on that blanket. Adenauer's bargains, sovereignty in exchange for Western alignment, amnesty for stability, were made in Bonn. They were also made at kitchen tables. Each family had one amnesty it granted to itself. The U.S. zone became Bavaria in a new way. The new constitution was adopted in 1946. The basic law for the Federal Republic came in 1949. Karl and his colleagues had to learn a new vocabulary: Grundrechte, basic rights, Sozialstaat, social state, Vergangenheitsbewältigung. The term would come later in public discourse, but the work it named was already being done or avoided in equal measure. The mathematics of a democracy are simple on paper: one person, one vote. The mathematics of a democratic culture are harder. The question is not just who votes. The question is what they can say without blowing up a room. There were moments when the big world crashed through. The Berlin blockade of 1948–49, with American C-47s droning overhead in airlifts, became a kind of proof that the West would stand. The Korean War boomed business in German factories. The rearmament debate split taverns. Should German soldiers exist again? Who should command? The files of the Housing Office record that in 1955, a former Wehrmacht captain applied for a larger flat to accommodate his new job in the Bundeswehr. He attached a letter from his pastor. Anständiger Mensch, decent person. The arithmetic of redemption was handwritten on church stationery. At the same time, the DP camps wound down. Feldafing closed in 1951. Many Jewish survivors emigrated to Israel or the United States. Some stayed. They opened shops in Munich. They walked past people who had not looked them in the eye in 1942. They had their own mathematics. It included anger, relief, business, routine. It included the efforts to rebuild a community in a place that had tried to erase it. Their presence was a proof and an accusation. It was also a challenge to the arithmetic of forgetting. The files show that Karl processed an application in 1952 for a shop lease to a man named Hirsch. The family had been in Munich before. The record is sparse, son of merchant, returned from DP. The district office approved the lease. The file contains a note. No objections from Hausgemeinschaft. That sentence contains a notion. There had been a time when an objection would have been reflex. Now, the reflex had shifted. Not to acceptance, perhaps, but to the logic of prices and leases. It was a kind of peace. Cold, practical, real. There were trials. Not only Nuremberg, which was a distant radio voice to most, there were smaller proceedings across Bavaria. Verbrechen gegen die Menschlichkeit, crimes against humanity translated into testimonials, depositions, placards on a courthouse door. Most Germans did not attend. The newspaper coverage was brief. Verdicts entered the public sphere as isolated events, not as a woven story. The 1953 amnesties, the pharmaceuticals list of cleansed names, the drifts of bureaucrats back into their chairs, blurred the lines further. The arithmetic of blame diluted. The algebra of everyday life demanded solutions in rent and wages. In 1956, Karl moved to a different desk. He was promoted to the planning department. He stamped site plans for new apartments near the Ostbahnhof. Brick by brick, Germany shifted from ash to stucco. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, was not a miracle. It had inputs, US dollars, German engineers, cheap labor, a global environment that needed goods after years of destruction. It had women who had been called into factories and then called back to the home and then back into part-time positions. It had ex-belly craftsmen who brought skills and habits from Königsberg to Kiel. It had the disciplined fact that people worked. The numbers were impressive. Growth rates in double digits in some years. Wages rising. Refrigerators arriving. The first small cars in courtyards built for bicycles. The math of comfort spread. With comfort came confidence. With confidence came forgetfulness. There were exceptions. There were individuals who pursued the past like a task. Teachers who refused to lie in their classes. Pastors who preached more than bland comfort. Jurists who refused rehabilitation for some. The Auschwitz trials in Frankfurt in 1963 forced something open. The televised testimonies made dinners quiet. They also made some people angry at being disturbed. The documents show both viewer figures and letters to editors complaining about an obsession with the past. The arithmetic of civic memory tilted back and forth with each broadcast. Karl felt the tilt. In his notebook, he wrote in 1964, "Eva asked me if I ever saw someone beaten for being Jewish. I said no. But I saw other things, and I said nothing about those either." Silence has tenses. There is the silence that is imposed. There is the silence that is chosen. There is the silence that is the price of staying employed. There is the silence that is the price of peace at breakfast. Brot gegen Schweigen. Bread against silence. The housing office had been his laboratory in the algebra of compromise. He had granted apartments to men with pasts he did not wish to examine too closely. He had allocated space to widows who wore suspicion like perfume. He had passed over names because his boss told him to. He had made exceptions for a person who had helped him find sugar in 1947. He had failed to make exceptions for a person who had shouted at him. He had become the system he administered, both necessary and guilty. He kept artifacts in his desk drawer. A ration card from December 1945, frayed at the edges. A Perselschein from 1948, written on soft ecclesiastical paper, praising a neighbor as helpful and decent. A newspaper clipping from 1951 announcing the closure of Feldafing DP camp. A photograph of Eva standing in front of a new apartment block with smooth walls. Each item was a number in the ledger. His ledger had more entries than the filing cabinets he had filled. His ledger was in his head. The war after the war was fought in sentences. I did not know. We all suffered. He was a good father. We had no choice. That was another time. They are sentences used by all peoples, after civil wars, after dictatorships, after crimes committed in their name. They are survival tools and obfuscations. The mathematics of self-respect requires them. The mathematics of justice rejects them. The housing office sat between those equations. There is a record of one meeting in 1959 when the housing shortage had eased enough that the office could consider amenities. Trees next to buildings. Playgrounds. Sun in kitchens. The minutes are dry. They say, orientation southwest if possible. They say, children's play area, 600 m² per block. They do not say, we have built over every story we cannot tell. They do not say, we have poured concrete into our mouths. They did not need to. The Cold War made new demands. Loyalty vetting for government employees now looked for communist sympathies more than Nazi ones. The arithmetic of threat had changed columns. The Federal Republic aligned with the West. The new enemy made old enemies look useful. The mathematics of redemption completed itself as the final category of bel estate, aged and retired, as lawyers found paths back to benches, as doctors with dissertations on heredity worked in respectable clinics. There were names known to those who knew. There were whispers. There was also the insistent rhythm of a country that paid taxes, built roads, went to the lakes on Sundays, and wanted to be normal. Normalization is the opposite of examination. It is the math of averages, not of outliers. In this math, the bombings become the story. Sirens, cellars, firestorms, the 1943 raids on Hamburg, the 1945 destruction of Dresden. These were real. They were horror. They also offered a way to speak about suffering without speaking about guilt. The ex-belly associations, the Vertriebenenverbände, had parades and speeches. They kept the keys to houses in Breslau and Königsberg that no longer had doors for them. The keys are heavy symbols. They balance the scales with a particular weight. They do not cover the other weights on the table. The table is still there. Karl's life went on. He ate lunches at a canteen. He took holidays at the KMC. He paid for a radio, then a television. He watched the 1954 World Cup win, the Wunder von Bern, with tears he did not expect. The team's comeback felt like a country's. It was not the same. It felt close enough. He did not join a veterans association. He was not a veteran. He was a civilian. But the veterans' parades went by his street. He watched them. He thought of who was not in those rows. He thought of who was not mentioned when they raised the beer. He retired in 1976. He kept the notebook. He began to write more. The tone is different from the early entries. The sentences indulge more confession. I knew the man in the office who had been in the SA. He was polite and efficient. He laughed at jokes. He spoke of his garden. He had air in his voice. I did not hate him. I thought of what he had done. I did not press him. I do not know if I could have. Maybe I could have. I did not. The rhythms of those lines have the relief of someone who knows he can no longer be fired. He wrote about the Trümmerfrauen. They were celebrated in the 1950s as builders of the new Germany. Monuments were made. Photographs showed their scarves, their dirt-smudged faces. There is sincerity in those images. There is also myth. In some cities, women did large rubble clearances. In others, men did, or foreign workers. The symbol is flexible. It is a comfort to honor women who built rather than to discuss men who broke. Karl knew a woman named Anneliese who had carried bricks in 1946. He saw her hands. He knew the difference between symbol and story in that case. He chose not to force the issue when others spoke. He was a decent man. He was also part of the system that chose certain stories to make the future easier to hold. He wrote about denazification as if it had been a fairy tale with real paperwork. There was an oath to the truth. There was a judge. There was a category. There was a stamp. I sat under the oaths and over the stamps. I saw that a stamp can make a man innocent or guilty. I used stamps for apartments. He understood what that meant. He understood that no one had asked him to confess all that he did not know. He understood that the files would not record the things he did not ask. An Allied intelligence summary from 1947 contains a sentence that could have been a caption for his files. In the interest of stabilization, a certain degree of social amnesia is observed and perhaps encouraged. That is precise. It is a description, not a condemnation. The Cold War did not create German amnesia. It gave it a safe place to live. It gave it budgets and uniforms and anthems. It gave it a family to belong to that no longer asked to be worshipped. In the 1980s, new conversations began. Students asked their teachers pointed questions. Towns looked for the routes of deportation buses in their own streets. Plaques appeared on sidewalks. Names were set in brass. Hiawatha here lived. Berlin took on the role of national memory maker. Munich doubled back on its own special past. Hauptstadt der Bewegung became Hauptstadt der Erinnerung, for a day when a new exhibition opened about the rise and complacency of 1930s Munich. The mathematics of memory acquired new variables. Grandchildren. Eva's son, Marcus, asked Karl if he had been a Nazi. He asked if Karl had known about the Jews. He asked if Karl had known about the Jews. He asked if Karl had profited from someone else's misery. He asked if the rooms he assigned had been taken from someone deported. Karl wrote in his notebook, "I said no to the first. I said no to the second, although I could have said maybe I should have seen. I said I do not know to the third. That is the worst answer." The worst answer is often the truest. It is also the most useless to a grandchild. It did not satisfy. It should not. The Bundesarchiv is full of files that answer the questions people ask their grandfathers. The answers are not kind. They are not a proverb. They are tables and memos, budgets and plans, a network of correspondence and graphs, signatures that now look anonymous. The system is a creature that no person can fold into their own biography cleanly. The person is the creature that signs the papers. The housing office had lists of Jewish apartments in 1938. The Nazi city administration had redistributed them. The war had redistributed them again. The American occupation had redistributed them a third time. When Karl wrote, "I do not know," he could have known. The file might have been at the end of his corridor. He did not walk there. In 1990, he was 80. He wrote a letter to the city archive offering his notebook for a future researcher. He wrote that it might be nützlich, useful. Utility is a reasonable word. The curator made a note. They did not take the notebook. They asked him to deposit it in the city museum. He did. It sat in a folder labeled Private Schriften, 1945 to 1976. A student quoted the first sentence in a thesis in 2001. "Wir haben Brot gegen Schweigen getauscht." What was dangerous in 1945 was banal in 2001. The tactics of silence had become a subject in their own right. Articles on Schweigespirale, Spiral of Silence, books with Erinnerungskultur, Culture of Memory, in their titles. Conferences with Vergangenheit as both subject and set. The arithmetic had changed. The new math of virtue was to acknowledge the old math of vice. Karl lived long enough to be called brave for saying what he had not said when it would have mattered more. He did not correct anyone. He did not say that he had not been brave. He smiled. The smile was both apology and relief. He died in 2003. His funeral was small. A pastor spoke. The pastor did not know the files. The pastor knew the man. He spoke of summer walks and quiet laughter. He spoke of Eva and Marcus. He spoke of a faithful public servant. He did not speak of rooms. He did not speak of cigarettes. He did not speak of feldafing. He did not speak of the line about bread and silence. He did not have to. The notebook was in a box. The city had moved on. The mathematics of grief is simple. One person subtracted, a set of memories left behind. But the file remains on a shelf in a building that did not exist in 1945. It sits next to other files that tell a similar arithmetic in different handwritings. A civil life after a war is a series of choices disguised as errands. It is the quiet click of a stamp on a form. It is the allocation of coal to a block. It is the decision to write a sentence you cannot say aloud. It is the signature on a whitewashing letter. It is the attendance at a screening of a film you could walk out of. It is the wave to a man you suspect of being a worse man than he appears. It is also the hand on a shovel, the hand on a pram, the hand pushing a vote into a ballot box. It is the sum of incalculables. This documentary, if it had a theme drawn like a line from the first page of a notebook to the last, would be the mathematics of trade. Silence traded for stability. Complicity traded for community. Justice traded for order. Memory traded for work. The currency shifts over time. Cigarettes, declarations, letters, euros. The ledger remains. In his last page, undated, shaky hand, Carl returned to the first sentence. He added words. He complicated it. We traded silence for bread. And then we taught ourselves to forget the trade. But the receipt is here. He underlined the last two words. He placed the notebook on his desk. He looked at the stamps he had kept as a relic and as a weight. He thought of the first weeks when Americans wrote the rules, when the curfew turned cities into still life paintings. He thought of women's hands in rubble. He thought of expellees carrying sacks into foreign neighborhoods. He thought of a wire fence in Feldafing and of a girl in a white dress inside it. He thought of a map of Munich on which he had drawn lines where buildings would be and children would suck on ice cream. The war ended in 1945. The arithmetic of it did not. He did not write more. He did not need to. He had summarized it on 27 May 1945 in a narrow room above a butcher's shop in a city making new out of ashes. He had made a bargain he did not fully understand. He had kept it, and it had kept him. The front line after 1945 ran through his memory and his paperwork, not across a battlefield.